and we will get started dealing with this new topic. I want to begin by posing a question to you that helps us to begin to get to the heart of the issue, which is, what is the link between the international sphere and domestic politics? And that question is, what are the links between globalization and domestic politics? This is a question that all of us, I think, have some sense of, because many of us, being alive today, have really come of age at a moment when economic interdependence, globalization, information technology have spread very rapidly in recent decades. And this has affected our experience and the way we see the world. And we are very much a product of this period of time. And I want to know, in what ways is domestic politics itself a product of globalization? And how does globalization affect politics? Any ideas?
Well, one way that globalization affects domestic politics is it creates domestic winners and losers for global policy. For example, with NAFTA, it created losers in the American steel, coal, and oil industries that is now causing sort of nativist and protectionist responses within the country.
Okay, so Ishan points out accurately and importantly that, look, globalization creates domestic winners and losers. Different interest groups are affected differently by free trade. When we open up our borders and trade more freely with Mexico, workers in labor-intensive industries in the United States are going to be hurt badly because labor is cheaper in Mexico than it is in the United States. And so a lot of that labor-intensive production is going to shift to Mexico. And that means then that there will be a lot of unemployed labor-intensive workers or workers who were previously in labor-intensive industries in the US. And they may be likely to channel their anger into support for nationalist politicians or parties who are willing to say that they'll bring their jobs back. So that's one example, the domestic winners and losers produced by globalization. What are some other ways that globalization affects domestic politics?
I think one way is also the sharing of ideas. For example, we have the protests going on over in the USA of Black Lives Matter, but then we also have other countries that are fighting their own police brutality. For example, Nigeria is fighting SAR, like the SARS movement, which is like their own police group. So I feel like now that we're in globalization, we have Twitter is global, TikTok is global, it's giving us, the young generation, the platform where we can share those ideas. And maybe we're inspiring other countries to start their own protests, or other countries are inspiring us. It's like a big revolution over the internet currently going on.
Yeah, so WhatsApp is a good example of an information technology or a social media technology that has been useful to pro-democracy movements. Why? Because WhatsApp is unencrypted, and so, or maybe it's encrypted. I'm sorry if I'm. Someone can clarify. I think it's encrypted, and so governments can't trace it. The whole point is that governments can't trace it. So during the Arab Spring, for instance, more than a decade ago at this point, WhatsApp was important because governments were trying to crack down and prevent communication, but people were using WhatsApp to organize rebellions, and they were able to do so successfully in places like Tunisia. And so TikTok is another example. These are technologies that proliferate ideas and that contribute to the sharing of ideas and the diffusion of ideas. Do you think that in Hong Kong, the pro-democracy movement has been helped by this global sentiment, this kind of pro-democracy movement, or increased awareness of the merits of democracy or the shortcomings of authoritarian rule? Without a doubt. And so globalization doesn't just mean economic winners and losers, it means the diffusion of ideas, information, consciousness. It means that we become aware of things that we didn't know previously existed. And so globalization, and we'll talk more specifically about what that exactly means in a moment, but for now, I want you to know that it really just means the sort of, really, it means structural change that integrates domestic and international markets. So reducing trade barriers, liberalizing the capital account, creating an economy that is more integrated with the global economy and that is more connected. This is what we mean by globalization. But there's an information component as well as a production component. There's a financial component. In this integration and this opening up becomes important because it diffuses ideas and it changes the distribution of the gains and the benefits from the economy, and it creates winners and losers. All of this has an effect on politics because those actors then take up arms politically, so to speak, or literally in some cases, to try to defend or win back their benefits or bring back a system that was more beneficial to them, or to use those ideas in a way that is useful to them to promote democracy. So before we continue, can we add anything else to this kind of icebreaker about the links between globalization and domestic politics, apart from the creation of winners and losers and the diffusion of ideas, both of which are very important? Is there anything else that we can add?
Professor, I think, for example, I think there's a link between, I think, war and presidents getting reelected, and that could have a big effect on it. Also, whenever there's, like, let's say, well, this is kind of like winners and losers, but whenever there's like tariffs and things that harm other individuals, like different industries, you can see a rise in dissatisfaction with the president.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like GDP. That's a good marker of like if a president is going to get reelected, and stuff like that.
Good, Joel. Joel, so I want to ask you, so since war tends to help the re-election of incumbent governments, do you think that makes it easier for them to undermine democracy, or do you think that helps to promote democracy?
I think it definitely undermines it if it's started with that intention to like help get them reelected. But if it's if the war is because of like some real, like, let's say, humanitarian issues, or different issues, I think maybe that might promote democracy.
Good. Yeah. So it could be nuanced.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Continue, Joel, please.
Oh no, yeah. I was just gonna say kind of like what you said. It's kind of nuanced in the fact that individuals are, if they agree with the war and if they agree with what's going on, that could help democracy. But for example, like when Bush, he started a war with I think it was Iraq. That it was kind of pointless for him to start that, and that definitely, I think, undermined democracy because he never really specified why they were going to invade, and it was just kind of jumbled up with 9/11. So I think that was a clear undermining of democracy. But again, I don't know. Like, it could be democratic if everybody agrees that there was a national, or not a national issue, like a global issue.
Yeah. So Joel has a really nuanced take here, and I want to highlight a few things. So in Argentina in 1983, the military regime was losing legitimacy, and they started a war, more or less a phony war, with Britain over a disputed set of islands, the Falklands Islands, which were inhabited by Brits. Anyway, the military attacked this island and attacked British installations because the military was trying to to win back support for its failing authoritarian regime. And in doing so, they were hoping to forestall a democratic transition. And so in this way, war would have been used to sustain authoritarian rule. In a similar way, Joel makes a comment about George Bush Jr. and the way that legislation like the Patriot Act was used to kind of peel back some civil rights and political liberties during the period after the invasion of Iraq and during that period where the long wars began after 9/11. We can view that as sort of a deterioration of sorts and a decline in democracy. Now, it's obviously not a regime change, but to Joel's point, war might help to undermine democracy if incumbents can use war to sort of concentrate power, stay in power, or sort of undermine essential rights and liberties as a part of doing business during that war. And so this is an interesting question because you'll see here later that one of the questions about the international sources of democratization concerns the impact of war. And what we'd find is that war tends to not necessarily undermine the likelihood of democratization, but it does make it more likely that a transition from one authoritarian regime to another will take place. And so war is yet another factor that we'll consider. And it's a factor that ties closely to international issues, globalization. War is something that we'll talk about. Now, let's continue and let's pick up and talk about how globalization becomes important and what it is and how it is one example of an international factor among many that might become important. So what is economic globalization? This is an important question because globalization is a buzzword that's thrown around. And I'm well aware that I even began this class asking you a question without really giving you the meaning of it. And the reason is because I wanted you to think about what it meant to you. In globalization as the integration of domestic and international markets is a process that has many, many dimensions. And those are ideological, but also economic and political and social. And so oftentimes our understanding of globalization is nuanced and sophisticated because it's a sophisticated process. But what we really mean by it, above all, is we mean economic globalization. And that is trade in terms of goods and services, financial transactions, labor migration. Economic globalization is characterized by increases in all of these things because states facilitate them by reducing barriers to trade, that is, eliminating tariffs, liberalizing the financial sector, meaning it's easy for banks to engage in transactions across borders, and then liberalizing the capital account, meaning that foreigners can purchase or engage in foreign direct investment. They can purchase factories domestically, or they can invest domestically and create assets and invest in the economy. Economic globalization is a set of processes that gives way to these increases in trade and transactions and migration through institutional change and the changing of policies to facilitate reducing barriers to trade, liberalizing the financial sector, and so on. And so economic globalization is a key part of the story because many people argue that economic globalization should cause democratization. And any argument that focuses on globalization can be adapted to imply the following. And this is the key central implication of this particular determinant, if you will. There should be a strong relationship between how integrated in the global economy a country is and whether it is a democracy. And so those countries that are deeply integrated in the global economy, like Switzerland, should be very, very democratic. Now, interestingly, countries like Hong Kong are also deeply integrated in the global economy, but they are not democratic. Now, of course, we know that Hong Kong's situation and its relation to China are different, But my point to you is that there obviously are exceptions. There obviously are deviations, but generally speaking, we expect to find a correlation between integration in the global economy and the presence or the absence of a democratic regime. Now, that's just one cause of democratization when it comes to international causes. Now, there are many others, and some of these have already been mentioned in discussions that have already begun here in the class. But some of those other causes include, for instance, economic interdependence, or when countries have economic relationships that expose them to the other and make it so that when one makes a policy change, it has knock-on effects on the other, and so on and so forth. Decolonization, like in Africa in the 1950s, when a number of new democracies were created, fragile democracies were created after the withdrawal of French, Belgian, and other colonial powers, the end of the Cold War, the late 1980s in Eastern Europe, when popular mobilization gave way to democratic transitions during a moment of the end of the Cold War. War itself has sometimes been linked to regime outcomes. War termination and the end of war has been associated with democratization. If, for example, democracy is imposed from the outside by victors, as in the Axis powers after World War II, changes in the Catholic Church that can spur changes in views that then kind of diffuse through countries that share a cultural or religious kind of affinity with the Catholic Church. International or intergovernmental organizations like the European Union often require members to be either democratic or pursuing democratic reforms. International organizations like the OECD also have these kinds of rules often. International broadcast media or social media or information technology, things that help to create a collective consciousness or that people come together over, or the ways that they share information. There's the diffusion of democratic ideas, or the sort of spreading or snowballing of ideas about democracy. And then there's military intervention, which has sometimes been a cause of regime outcomes or a cause of regime change. All of these are examples of international causes. And all of them have in common that they, of course, reside outside of the domestic borders of a given country. And this is an important note, and we'll talk more about this momentarily, what this means literally and in practice. But it's important first because all of the different explanations we've talked about so far in the class have been domestic explanations. They have focused on causes that reside within the boundaries of states. And in doing so, they've largely thought of democratization in comparative terms, not so much as an internationally driven phenomenon. But from the perspective of an internationally driven phenomenon, anytime democratization occurs, there's always going to be sort of a wave of democratization. Now, this is something that you're familiar with and that you remember from early on in the course. Remember that a wave of democratization is basically a group or a cluster of transitions that take place around at the same time. And it's a significant number of transitions that leaves behind fewer autocracies and creates a much larger number of consolidated democracies. And there have been three of these waves, or of these clusters, these moments, or these groupings of transitions. The first wave, the second wave, and then the third wave. And these democratization waves can be triggered by the end of the Cold War, like in Eastern Europe, the diffusion of ideas like the transnational commitment to democracy that was often a feature of debate and discourse in Latin America, and also the diffusion of practices and events. So the formation of new democracies in the region often influences the formation of new democracies elsewhere in the region. We call that snowballing. But these waves are brought on by these international causes, because the nature of an international cause is to be a cause that resides among nations and therefore is likely to affect multiple nations. And so whenever we talk about an international cause of democratization, not far behind is a discussion about the waves of democratization that are caused by those international forces. Now, before we go further, we've got to step back even further and address a sort of abstract analytical issue that is lurking in this discussion that we've yet to get to. And this is the question of levels of analysis. Now, I already told you that international factors are unique because they reside outside of the domestic boundaries of a state. And our modern contemporary nation states that we examine, we've so far treated as wholes, right? As entities that contain the causes and the outcomes. This discussion moves us away from that. Globalization is an international factor. It resides at a different level of analysis than domestic politics. A level of analysis is what we would call a social structure that we examine for its effects on another social structure or the same social structure. Really what we mean is we mean three levels: the international level, the state level, and the individual level. Now, democratization happens at the state level. It is a transition from authoritarian to democratic rule that takes place within the boundaries of a sovereign state. But international factors like globalization obviously reside at the international level. And so what's distinctive about this discussion is, for the first time ever, we're pivoting from the state level to the international level, and then moving from the international level back to the state level, and using international factors to explain state level outcomes. This is something that gets us in the realm of international relations, where levels of analysis are very important, because you've got leaders, you've got states, and you've got the state system. And so we can learn from those international relations scholars who use these levels of analysis by pointing out that democratization happens at the state level, globalization and other international factors happen at the system level. And so going forward, I want you to keep this in mind, and keep in mind what sophistication and complexity this adds to the analysis, and then also what it means for, well, the comparisons or the evidence that you would look for, and so on and so forth. Now, before we continue, I want to ask you, what are some other examples of international factors that you think could lead to democratization? What are some other factors that reside here at the international level that would affect the form of government or the regime outcome at the state level? Besides globalization, besides war, diffusion, changes in the Catholic Church, international or intergovernmental organizations, and so on and so forth. Can you think of other examples? What have we missed?
Can we say that the economic?
So what economic factors do you think might be key?
I'm not. I don't remember the specific, but I would say factors such as the IMF or some form of monetary injection that stimulates a country to either change its the way it. Damn it.
No, this is great, Jose. So, Jose, I think that one thing that's interesting is it can probably work both ways, right? Like, you can imagine the IMF fronting a poor country like the money they need to get through a rough patch. and then that country transitioning to democracy. But you can also imagine the IMF saying, look, we don't feel comfortable giving you the money unless you transition to democracy first. And this is often what we see, actually. And so this actually takes me to a comment by UL, who says, what about the IMF? The World Bank is willing to provide aid at the expense of control of foreign countries' domestic policies. This is exactly right. International in non-governmental organizations, well, in intergovernmental organizations like the IMF, are able to use the leverage that they have to maybe pressure countries to undertake democratic reforms or to transition to democracy altogether. But Jose, you're exactly right, because the whole point is that that stimulus or that kind of factor can help to propel change, right, of some kind. What kind of change and what order those things go in is maybe the question that you were sorting out, but you're exactly right to suggest that the IMF might be important. So, Daisy, the IMF would often say, well, you've got to lift your tariffs if you want us to front you the money, or if you want to put yourself in the driver's seat to get out of this crisis with the short-term loans that we could provide you. And so tariffs are often part of the economic policies that countries have to reform in order to obtain credit or to obtain a better relationship with other countries or trading partners and so on. And so, Daisy, that's right. Tariffs can be an important part of the equation, especially if someone who has leverage over a country is in a position to say that you should get rid of those tariffs and you should consider a transition to democracy. Tyler says international trade. Yeah, and we would put that under international economic interdependence. Yoel is asking and had mentioned that foreign countries' domestic policies are often of great value to intergovernmental organizations like the World Bank or the IMF. And so we shouldn't be surprised if the IMF and the World Bank have strong preferences regarding what form of government they might want or would be most favorable or supportive for a country who owes the IMF money. Now, who controls the IMF, by the way? Well, it's controlled disproportionately by the richest countries who contribute disproportionately to the fund. And so all those decisions are decisions made by, the US and Germany and the European Union and others who control it. What do they want? Well, they want primarily what the creditor institutions inside those countries want. They want forms of government that are going to be vanilla and moderate and help to protect the financial interests of those creditor institutions in those lending countries like the United States. And so oftentimes what that means is they want democracies where the risk of expropriation or predation by the state is substantially lower, and they could enjoy the economic benefits of the system. This means then that there are very strong preferences that international actors have regarding the form that government will take in a given country. And so don't be surprised when economic policies are often tied up with political reforms, and when banks and non-governmental or intergovernmental organizations have a certain say in these decisions. Another possible factor that we didn't list, what about worldwide economic crises like the Great Depression? What about worldwide social or health or public health crises like COVID-19? How will these events affect democracy? Will they promote democracy? Or will they undermine democracy and make it more difficult to sustain democracy? Will they make failed democratic transitions more likely and democratic failures more likely? Those are questions that might remain sort of unanswered for a while as we sort of figure things out. What impact will COVID have? Will it weaken those democratic institutions, and will it make transitions harder? It might. It very well might. What I want you to be open to is that there are a lot of different causes that originate in this international sphere. And those causes are often more complex and more sophisticated simply because there are many more actors involved, because all those states are also part of the international system. And so the international sphere contains a great deal of complexity. And there's always the possibility that some new cause lurks in that international sphere. And it's one that we don't understand very well. And this brings us to the next phase of this discussion, which begins to contrast domestic and international causes of democratization and puts them really next to each other, and thinks about the relative importance over time. And the starting point for this is the fact that the links between globalization and democracy, or international factors and democracy, are actually way under theorized. So everything that we've talked about so far in the course, it's pretty well established in the literature. There are theories about it: modernization, for example, social forces, the strategic approach. These are all theoretical traditions that have been well established and that have firm sort of foundations. The truth is that we don't have any theories of the international causes of democratization. Those theories have mainly focused on those domestic issues that I just re-enumerated, and they've tended to overlook these international causes. Now, why is that? Well, one reason is that there are tons of them. I gave you a list a moment ago that had like 10 different items on that list. With that complexity, it's hard to create any general theory of the international causes of democratization. What's doing the work? It doesn't really lend itself to specifying or figuring that question out. And there's also the fact that early studies found it really hard to document evidence of global causes of democratization. They found it very hard. And they were often surprised that there wasn't more of a role, at least that appeared in the data, for those international causes. But there's I think an important wrinkle here, and something that those early studies were not able to account for because of when they happened in time. And that is that international factors have become far more important in the last 30 or 40 years. Basically, since 1980, international causes have become centrally important. And this has largely been because this period of time has coincided with the deepening of globalization and what we've sometimes referred to as the most recent wave of globalization. This has been a period when free trade, financial transactions, and labor migration have all increased dramatically. So it should be no surprise that the period of the most intense globalization has also been the period maybe when there's been more of a role for international causes. Now, on the other hand, everything basically up until the early post-war period was very different. It could be that domestic causes explain those democratizations. It could be that during that period of the Great Depression in World War II, domestic factors of the kind that showed up in Europe in earlier generations were still important, but that period since then, beginning with the post-war period, has seen the rise of these international factors. We're faced then with a question: could it be that domestic causes better explain democratization before World War II, but international influences, both economic and political, better explain transition since? Yeah, this is interesting. This is interesting. How can we assess this possibility? If we wanted to figure out, is it actually true that domestic causes better explain democratizations before World War II, but international ones better explain transitions since? How could we assess that? How could we do that?
You could look at transitions that happened pre and post World War II and evaluate the amount of foreign influence in each transition.
Yeah, and this would be a most similar systems design because we have these two periods and, well, on the other hand, it might be a most different systems design the more I think about it. If they both have a lot of transitions, no, it would have to be a most similar systems design because, well, the third wave of democratization that corresponded with the most recent period saw many more transitions. And as Ishan points out, we can assess this possibility by comparing foreign influence during the first period and assessing it during the second, and then figuring out, well, was there less foreign influence during the first? Was that in fact the case? Maybe it's the case that there was just as much foreign influence during the period before World War II. And there was also a lot of foreign influence during the period after World War II. Well, that would be interesting because that would suggest that, well, maybe the foreign influences are less important. Maybe those domestic influences are more important. Or maybe those foreign influences during the second period are less consequential. So one way to assess this is to compare the first reverse wave of democratization and the third wave of democratization. Now, you know about these waves. This is not new to us. But let's go ahead and review what we remember about these patterns. So remember that in 1942, at the very sort of trough of the first reverse wave, the number of democracies had fallen to 12. And this mostly included new democracies like Italy and Japan. And these new democracies were weak and were relatively vulnerable to new populist and authoritarian movements in countries like that. Now, if we fast forward to 1972 to 2006, the period of the third wave, you find the number of democracies tripling and growing at a rate that is unparalleled in history. This is the third wave. Now we ask ourselves, did international factors cause the third wave of democratization? Was there a substantial degree of foreign influence during that period? And then were foreign influences relatively absent during the first reverse wave? Notice that this is what we need to observe to try to figure out, are we actually correct in trying to explain the third wave of democratization with these international factors? So we can test this and find out for ourselves. Before we do that, let's just remind ourselves what this looks like. Remember that we have our first wave of democratization, which lasted more than about 100 years. We had our first reverse wave that lasted a few decades. We had our second wave that lasted about 2 decades, and then our second reverse wave that lasted about 10 years, and then our third wave, which lasted about 3 decades. Now, these are those different clusters or those different groupings of transitions in time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to compare the third wave to the first reverse wave and try to figure out what's actually going on in terms of the international influences at the time. So the pre-World War II period, our first period, our first reverse wave, if we go to the scene, what we find is the following. This is a period of profound global economic depression, high levels of economic nationalism in the form of the nationalization of industries, expropriation, states taking on all these essential industrial functions, all so that they can self-provide during this period of downturn, when countries are slamming their doors and choosing to go it alone to try to protect themselves from the spread of the recession and the depression. And in addition to expropriation and taking on new functions, states erect high barriers to trade. They give huge subsidies to domestic industry. They do all of this to try to create the ingredients for domestic production that can stand in for the international production that used to provide them the goods that they need, but are now too expensive to obtain in this context of depression. Now, this is a circumstance that is absolutely rife with big domestic influences. You've got a big state pursuing industrialization, big state enterprises, corporatist actors of labor and business. You've got a large state machinery set up to create and cultivate this domestic market and to hold up these barriers to trade. There are no international influences to speak of in this context. This is a context dominated by domestic influences. And those domestic influences, to the extent that they affect democratization, have to be the ones that affected democratization, because there were no international influences to speak of. And so to the extent that the transitions took place, they couldn't have been because of foreign influences. And even earlier periods in time didn't have the same degree of international influence that would characterize the post-war period in the late 20th century. And this was a period that could not be more different compared to that earlier period. Now, some of you have already talked about, for example, the IMF or intergovernmental organizations that have leverage over governments. But there are others that are equally important and that we have to keep in mind. So for instance, during this period, beginning in essentially the mid-1970s, but intensifying in the 80s and the 90s, international banks made long-term loans to developing countries contingent on democratization or political reforms towards democracy. Very simple. We want a more favorable environment for our investment. If we're going to give you the money, then you need to hold free, fair, and frequent elections, and you need to protect civil rights and liberties and do the things that are essential to protect our investment. This is it. This is the condition. How about that for an international influence? Here are poor countries who need the money and who've got to make political reforms in order to get it. There are also examples like the EU, the European Union, only allowing countries to join if those countries democratize or if they undertake important political reforms that deepen democracy. So one of the reasons that Turkey never joined the EU is because they never were able to credibly commit to democracy. The military always had too much influence, was never under civilian control. And in recent years, there's been a concentration of power in the executive in a further movement away from democracy. The EU is one example, but there are others like the OECD, some organizations and like the Organization of American States have less influence, but still pressure countries to pursue democratic reforms. And then there are international agencies like the IMF that made loans and other short-term assistance that countries desperately needed to make balance of payments. They made those contingent on democratization or political reforms. And so when we talk about international influences, we talk about globalization, it's not just the case that globalization creates domestic winners and losers. It also introduces this bevy of international actors who have an interest in domestic politics and who want to see certain types of outcomes for X, Y, and Z reasons because their economic interests are better supported by certain types of regimes. Now, we don't need to go into detail to explain why a democratic form of government might be better for an international bank than a repressive military regime. That bank's loan to that country will perform better in a freer environment where people are freer to invest, don't fear expropriation, and don't fear what might happen to them under repressive military rule. You can easily see why investors might be more open and favorable to democracy than authoritarian rule, for reasons that we discussed last week as well, related to the safety of their investments and the incentives that different types of regimes present economic actors with. The whole point is that globalization introduces all these different actors that reside outside of the domestic boundaries of the state, and who then have an interest or a stake in what takes place inside that state. Those actors can be expected to use the leverage that they have in predictable ways. And so this is what we get. So this period, this late 20th century, this third wave of democracy, it coincided with a period that was characterized above all by big international influences: banks, international organizations, international agencies, and it was characterized as well by small domestic influences. Tiny, tiny states, sometimes seemingly powerless governments, kind of sort of frail in the face of the IMF or the EU or whoever else it is who's requiring them to pursue reform in exchange for a loan or for entry into the EU or so on and so forth. And so this is the reality, and this is the nature of this period of time. Yeah, the US does still provide money to Turkey. There's also a military relationship that's a little strange. UL says, would NATO and the Warsaw Pact also be examples? Totally. NATO is an example of what began as sort of a geopolitical alliance designed to contain or create a buttress that could contain any reemergence of communism. At least in the post-Cold War era, that's the purpose. But obviously, NATO also has the capacity to influence the behavior of states if it can threaten to pull its support if countries don't pursue democratic reforms. Now, then the question becomes, well, what does NATO want? And who do the powers who control NATO, what do they want? And so then we're asking really primarily about what the United States and some Western powers want in terms of regime type. And we've got to get into their interests and their considerations. Warsaw Pact, interesting question. I don't know enough about it to really say, but if you think it works in the same way as NATO, very likely it could have that same kind of influence. Now, this discussion that we've been having so far, we've tiptoed around a really important point, which is that more than any other set of drivers of democratization, the international factors lend themselves to very clear political implications. Now, what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is that these international factors carry very clear instructions for what to do if they really do cause democratization. That is, what should international organizations be doing if they want to promote democracy? What leverage should they be using? What kind of leverage is useful to an international bank that wants to bring about a regime change in a country or an international organization like the OECD? What steps can the international community take to promote democracy according to the literature and what we understand about democracy and its international causes? So there are a few that we'll discuss. And the first one of those is the diffusion of democratic ideas. Now, this diffusion of democratic ideas, it plays with that notion that democracy itself is contagious. Is democracy contagious? It might be. We know two important things about democracy and whether it's contagious or not. The first one is that the proportion of democratic neighbors that a country has increases the likelihood that that country will transition to democracy if it has not already. Now, that's an important fact because that means then that that snowballing that happens tends to leave fewer autocracies behind and create more democracies. Relatedly, there's the finding that membership in regional international organizations where most members are democratic increases the chance that a country will democratize. Now, this is related to that first finding, and it suggests in a similar way that what happens in the neighborhood matters a great deal. What happens across the way or in your backyard has an impact on what happens in your backyard, and so on and so forth. Now, there are a couple problems with this argument. First of all, and I don't have this listed here, but it's important, the diffusion argument doesn't account for the beginning of that process of diffusion. In other words, who's the first one to transition? Who sets off that domino effect, that snowball pattern? How does it get underway? It doesn't just begin nowhere, it begins somewhere. And wherever it begins, it can't be considered itself a product of some process of diffusion. And so diffusion as a process has to begin in a way that is not a part of diffusion. And so the story breaks down a little bit because it doesn't explain the beginning of a process that itself is essential for that process to take place. And so, for instance, in Latin America, Mexico is a country that has sometimes gone first in terms of democratic reforms. Now, in some important ways, they are exceptional because they transitioned in 2000. But for instance, Mexico created a human rights body that promotes human rights and civil and political liberties before any other Latin American country did. And this can be viewed in the subjective way as promoting or deepening democracy. But Latin America's decision to create those bodies in every country of the region, that process began in Mexico, but Mexico's process did not begin somewhere else. How do we explain Mexico? That's one problem. The other problem is that there's really a correlation between membership in democratic regional international organizations and having democratic neighbors. So do countries democratize because they have democratic neighbors or because they join a club of democratic countries? We can't really know. We can't really sort that out. Now, one way we can do it is by using case studies and trying to use natural experiments to highlight patterns of similarity and difference and figure out the timing of decisions made by countries who do or do not join these organizations and who do or do not transition to democracy. But that is the research that I leave to you in a class like this, where we evaluate these different causes using our own original evidence. So the diffusion of democratic ideas, it's a very important story, and it carries a very clear political implication, which is that you should promote the diffusion of these ideas across borders so as to bring about democracy rapidly in sets of countries and in regions of countries. But it does have two problems. The first being that it cannot account for the first instance. It starts the pattern, and it has a problem of correlation when it comes to belonging to regional organizations and having democratic neighbors. Now, the second factor that carries clear implications is a factor of war and regime change. And this is an interesting topic because it gets us to one of the parts of our discussion from earlier where we talked about war and its potential influence. Now, the sort of backdrop here is that it's widely believed that war is not a cause of transitions from democratic to authoritarian rule, but really the reverse. excuse me, no, I meant to say that it's believed to be a cause of transitions from democratic to authoritarian rule, a cause of democratic failure, as we've called it. But the evidence is not conclusive on this. And so even though the expectation is that democratic failure should result from war, um, there's really a mixed set of results. And so some find that war affects the survival of both leaders and regimes, no matter what. All types of regimes and all leaders are less likely to survive because war is so destabilizing. But there's other evidence that shows that wars increase the likelihood of transition from one authoritarian regime to another, but without decreasing the likelihood of democratization at any given time. And so there's conflicting reports here. And the point is that there's not a clear implication regarding what countries can do to bring about or to stop war in hopes of bringing about a regime change. And this maybe shouldn't surprise you. War is by its very nature violent, destabilizing, horrific. It's the most costly of all potential options, and it's meant to be the one that's used at the very end when all other options are exhausted. Why should such a violent alternative be conducive to democracy? The logic seems to be relatively clear and straightforward, but when you consider, for instance, that war can also create opportunities in political vacuums that can be filled by democratic movements, it becomes possible, at least theoretically, that war could lead to a different outcome. And war could also lead to a different outcome if the termination of the war means that the losers have to accept what's imposed on them by the victors. And if those victors themselves want democracy, say the Allied powers after World War II, well, that could be part of a transition to democracy that comes from a foreign influence and it comes from war. Now, there is evidence that wars in the neighborhood decrease the likelihood of democratization. And so maybe this has to do with the sort of knock-on effects of military intervention and how that can work against momentum for liberalization in nearby countries. And so, interestingly, there seems to be a relationship or a link between war and diffusion. And what I want you to notice as we move on is that it is very difficult to kind of sort out these relationships. In this case, for example, if there is evidence that wars in the neighborhood decrease the likelihood of democratization, does that mean there's some diffusion of non-democratic ideas that comes from war itself? And does that mean that war and diffusion go hand in hand to affect these outcomes? This is the kind of complexity that becomes possible when we have multiple levels of analysis and where the international sphere is so infinitely complex because of the number of states and the number of different interests and different sovereignties that kind of overlap. Now, the third factor that carries clear political implications relates to sanctioning and regime change. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the merits of sanctions. Should we sanction certain leaders and regimes? Should we freeze their assets and their bank accounts? Should we do so in an effort to spur some sort of democratic opening in that country? What kinds of steps should we take to try to support nascent democratic movements in that place? And how might sanctions be a part of a package designed to improve the prospects for democracy? Notice that wherever we talk about sanctions, we're talking about some other state or some other alliance of states who have decided that they prefer a regime change in some other state. And so whenever we talk about foreign influence, there's an actor on the other side of that process. And that actor can be the state. It can be an alliance of states. It can be an international organization or non-governmental organization. In this case, with sanctions, we're talking about states. Now, what about sanctions? Well, what we know is that sanctions can bring down leaders. It's just not dictators. And so, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because sanctions are used as a weapon, as part of an effort to bring about some desired outcome, and often one that is viewed as more democratic. But what we know is that although they are effective at bringing down democratic leaders, sanctions have little effect on the survival of dictators. And the reason has to do with the fact that dictators can rely on the support of other dictators or other rogue states quite easily when they are blackballed or sanctioned by other powers. And the reason is because those other dictators who might support them have often also been sanctioned. And so for every China, there's a North Korea. For every Russia, there's a North Korea, and so on and so forth. The point is that these dictators tend to stick together. And so it makes them more invulnerable compared to, say, democratic leaders who, if sanctioned, will almost certainly lose the support or the same backing of other democratic leaders. And that will in turn weaken them politically and make them more vulnerable to being brought down either electorally or in some other way. And so sanctions don't tend to produce the outcomes that we might hope for from the perspective of democratization. So ultimately, then, we can't say if authoritarian regimes are really affected by sanctions. We know that democracies are affected. It's just that authoritarian regimes don't appear to be. And in the end, what that means is that not only are there many, many international factors, but some of those factors that appear to be within the reach of international and intergovernmental organizations are themselves a little non-conclusive. Sanctions don't appear to work to bring about democratic transitions. War is inconclusive in terms of its effects. The diffusion of democratic ideas seems to work, but how to begin that process is not specified. What this means then is that the options available to international organizations in the international community are limited. And not only are they limited, but it may not be clear what button to push, so to speak. And so if you're wondering, for instance, whoever thought that military intervention in Iraq would help to facilitate democratization and state building? Well, maybe it's because there's never been a lot of clarity about what can actually help to bring about these transitions and what can actually help to promote democratization. There seems to be as much confusion, if not more confusion than clarity. One thing that we do know is that military intervention virtually never helps to bring about regime change, or at least democratization. And so there are some real questions about the options available to the international community in light of this long list of different international factors that we either suspect cause democratization or we know have some impact. And before we wrap this up, and we have about 8 minutes, and I don't want you to leave yet. Before we wrap this up, I want to ask you, just kind of from your perspective, what international factor do you think is the most important? When it comes to international factors, which one do you think is most likely to cause democratization? If there's one that you could point to, which one would it be, and for what reason?
I think of the ones that were listed, I would pick diffusion of democratic ideas because it kind of makes the most sense intuitively that if your neighbors are all doing one thing and it's working for them economically, you would follow them.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the logic of appropriateness, right? Like, you want to fit in. we all remember when we were in school and you either got the shoes that someone cool had, or you got something that someone cool had, or maybe you were cool and people did what you did. But that was a logic of appropriateness and they were emulating you. And that kind of is the same thinking that goes into this process of diffusion. It works for them. It seems to bring benefits to them. Why don't we do the same thing? And what it is that links diffusion and democratization, it could be a logic of appropriateness, right? You want to do what's appropriate in the eyes of those around you. It could be maybe there's some economic benefit or some kind of other gain that comes from that. But either way, the diffusion of ideas appears to be relevant because it seems to really create momentum for democratization. Can we hear from some others? What do you think is the key factor when it comes to the international causes of democratization?
Adding on to what he said, I think also I'm not sure if Peeve House is the one that said this, but how democratic neighbors kind of team up and pressure authoritarian regimes and challenge them. I think that's also another factor that can play a major role in the spread of democratization.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Karen. And I think that was Peeve House, actually. It's an example that relates to the experience in Latin America right now, especially when it comes to the fact that countries like Chile, Argentina to a lesser degree, Uruguay, are taking an increasingly critical stance against the Maduro regime in Venezuela. And it's losing the support, and it has long since lost the support of those governments. But that critical stance that they've taken has been useful because it kind of adds to the pressure, and it kind of puts pressure on Venezuela to introduce reforms or to liberalize or to undergo a transition to democracy. And many of you might be interested to hear that recently in Venezuela, the Maduro administration has actually introduced legislation to privatize the oil industry and to return expropriated companies to their original owners. And they're also allowing the dollar to circulate freely, and they're relaxing some of the price controls that previously were in place. And that is important because this liberalization seems to suggest that the regime is responding to some pressure that's either coming from inside or outside. And that pressure is reducing the available options. And what we can hope is that internationally speaking, well, maybe that critical stance taken by Uruguay and Chile and others is helping to kind of back Venezuela into a corner. Now, again, we're talking about from the perspective of promoting democracy in Venezuela. And we know that in Venezuela, it's a humanitarian crisis that is fundamentally driven by a political and an economic crisis that's been characterized by the collapse of democracy in that country. And so the contemporary experience in Latin America shows us that some of that pressure comes from those nearby countries. And the pressure that they put on those authoritarian holdouts, it's often something that they do cooperatively. And this is the benefit, according to Peeve House and others, of not just regional organizations, but the kind of increasing number of democracies in the neighborhood, so to speak. What are some other factors that you think might be so essential or so important? So the reason that this question matters a great deal is because remember that there is no general theory of the international causes of democratization. In fact, it's under-theorized, that link between international sphere and domestic politics. Part of that is because there are so many factors and so many potential factors. Part of it is because only recently have we amassed evidence that seems to support a connection between those variables. But the reason this matters a great deal is because for us to do any theorizing and to plot the connection between those variables, you need to think very carefully about what are the key variables. You know, is it war? Is it economic globalization? Is it the diffusion of ideas? You know, is it the rise of intergovernmental organizations like the EU? What exactly is it that's so essential about that international sphere? And what is the most important when it comes down to it? Because that is the variable that you would want to create a theory based upon. To the extent that we make choices about what to emphasize, that's a choice we would make. And so you would need to think carefully about, well, what does the evidence suggest is the most important factor? What do the patterns seem to suggest? I think the last thing I'll leave you with as we depart is that the evidence since 1980, which is the period that's been most intensely characterized by international factors, the evidence suggests that the influence of non-governmental organizations like banks, organizations, financial institutions, that influence is really critical. Non-governmental organizations can use leverage to take away options and alternatives from governments and essentially leave them with no choice but to transition. If there's a single factor that seems to set apart third wave from earlier waves, it's the entry of those non-governmental organizations. And we can talk at length about the size and the complexity of those organizations, but that is a key difference that characterizes the third wave that was not present in earlier waves. Even earlier waves of globalization did not feature multinational corporations of the size, the scale, and the scope, the complexity, and the power of international financial institutions and banks in the various MNCs that characterize the period since 1980. And so in the end, I want you to be sensitive then to interests and how the interests of these non-governmental actors become so critical. This does conclude our discussion for today, everybody. We're going to continue talking about this on Wednesday, where we'll have some case studies, we'll have some more evidence, and we'll try to evaluate some of these arguments using case studies as opposed to some of the bigger patterns. Thank you for being here, and I hope to see you on Wednesday, and I hope that you have a great week.